Shabbat Shalom, good to be seen.
Shabbat Shalom. So today is about two people, basically, what we're talking about here. And so I just want to give my own little introduction. I met Joel Schickman in the copy room at Shearith, Israel in my first year working at Shearith, Israel. It was a Sunday morning, and he was preparing copies for religious school. He had his guitar on his back, and I struck up a conversation with him about guitar playing, something that I did for many years, but at that point in my life, I had not done for the past decade. He convinced me to pick up my guitar once again, and we played together many times. Highlight for me was when we played together at Shelley's and my wedding, and I told the story of my courtship of Shelley through Beatles songs. And you'll indulge me here for just a second. I'm going to share a picture of that. Well, you see it off. Let's close the purpose. There we go. All right. Back in. I met Rabbi Daniel Greyber at a Chevra Kadisha convention a couple of years ago. I went to the convention alone and I didn't know a soul there. On the first night at dinner, I looked around and I noticed him. He looked familiar to me, although I knew that we didn't actually know each other. I went up to him and said something to the effect of, "We haven't met, but I am sure I've seen you before. I have an association in my head, but I'm unsure why. The association is Joel Schickman." Turns out that Rabbi Graber had been to Shearith, Israel for Joel's funeral, and also maybe another time or two, perhaps for a Schickman bar mitzvah. Not only that, but he wrote a whole book on the experience of losing his friend Joel and would be presenting on that book at the conference. Moreover, he came with a delegation from his synagogue, and they allowed me to hang out and become an honorary member of their delegation for the conference. Rabbi Daniel Greyber, is the rabbi of Bethel Synagogue in Durham, North Carolina. He grew up in Potomac, Maryland, and spent the first 21 years of his life focused on competitive swimming. He was a gold medalist and captain at the U.S. swimming team at the 1993 World Maccabiah Games. Rabbi Graber holds a master's in speech and communication studies from Northwestern University and was ordained in 2002 at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies of American Jewish University, where he received the Henry Fisher Award for Outstanding Achievement in Jewish Studies. Upon his rabbinic ordination in 2002, he became the executive director of Camp Ramah in California. That's another connection to Shearith, Israel, because after he left, I believe is when Rabbi Joe Menashe, who was our associate rabbi here, filled his shoes. So he became the executive director of Camp Ramah in California and the Max and Pauline Zimmer Conference Center of American Jewish University. While in his role at Ramah, Rabbi Graber was an adjunct faculty member of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, teaching courses on liturgy, Hanukkah, and a variety of seminars about Judaism and the American Rabbinic. Rabbi Graber served as a scholar in residence for programs for the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles and a variety of conservative synagogues throughout the West, and as a teacher at conventions of the Rabbinical Assembly and Jewish Educators Assembly. After a 9-year tenure at Ramah, he spent the 2010 and 11 academic year in Jerusalem as a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mandel Leadership Institute in Israel. And in July 2011, he became the rabbi of Beth El Synagogue. He is married to his wife, Jennifer, and Abba to their 3 boys, Alon, Benjamin, and Ranon. And I'm here to say also that he's a general nice guy. So,
Thank you, Avi. I hope my mother heard that presentation. I sent her the link for today.
So I just want to, we're gonna start off, and I'm going to ask Rabbi Graber to tell us about his story, how he came to meet Joel, how he came to love Joel, and what happened to him, what the subject of his book is about when Joel went through his leukemia and, of course, eventually passed away.
Thank you. Thank you, Avi. I want to say a couple of things just to begin. First of all, Avi, it's wonderful to see you again, and you brought back a lot of very sweet memories of our connection meeting. And I want to say a special Shabbat Shalom to Rabbi Ari Sunshine, who put into the chat another product of Har Shalom. So I indeed grew up at Har Shalom in Potomac, Maryland, and Ari and I have known each other pretty much all of our lives. Grew up going to the same synagogue, and remember his, in particular, your father very fondly. Just for all of his leadership in the conservative movement. I want to say a hello to everybody joining us this morning, and I hope that your congregation has been minimally affected by all of the events of the past month or so in Texas. I hope that your families are well and that your houses are intact, and if not, that you are on the way back to having good plumbing and good electricity. But Texas has certainly been in our prayers. Indeed, I have very fond memories. I think the last time that I was at Shearith was for Coleman Schickman's bar mitzvah, which was, he's the same age as our eldest son. I was chatting with Rabbi Sunshine, our eldest would be, is 21 years old, and he took off for the year during the pandemic, but senior in high school. So that gives you a sense of how long ago the bar mitzvah was. I think 8 years ago now, but I know that having Rabbi Sunshine as the leader of the congregation is a blessing, and Rabbi Mitzner and everybody, just it's wonderful to see you. I think that what I want to do is just take a moment and tell you I wrote a book, which is what Rabbi Mitzner was telling you about. Faith Unravels. A rabbi's struggle with grief and God, and I'm going to begin. Just by reading you a couple of paragraphs.
Oh, help me.
By reading you a couple of paragraphs from the book. The truth is that when Joel passed away in 2007, there's a backstory to that. Which is that when I was in high school, I had a best friend whose name was Jay Rosen, and Jay had died of leukemia, as Joel did many years later. And I want to just read you my experience of finding out about Jay's death and being at his funeral. And I'll explain why it is that I'm reading. Rabbi Sunshine just told me that the Schickmans are watching on Facebook Live, so I just want to say to Heather and to Coleman and Miles and Ellis, love you guys so much, and so blessed to be here, and just always holding you so close in my heart, to the whole Schickman family. So when my friend Jay passed away, I write in the book as follows. I'm just going to read you a couple of paragraphs. We cling to an illusion of safety. We try to protect ourselves by believing death happens according to a schedule. When we are young and a grandparent dies, we tell ourselves death happens to people who are old. I'm young, so I am okay. Jay's death took away from me the luxury of illusion. Death has its own schedule. I learned about Shiva from my grandparents' deaths. Shiva is a 7-day period of mourning after a funeral. Mourners aren't supposed to leave the house, bathe, shave, have sex. The community makes prayer services, brings meals, and visits the mourner's home. Too often, people do not know what to do or say, so they avoid coming altogether. Or they say things that are more hurtful than helpful. Jewish tradition teaches we should enter the home, sit quietly, and let the mourner begin the conversation. But many people are scared of silence, so they talk instead. I also learned that the only people who are required to sit Shiva are family. The Jewish legal tradition defines a mourner as one of 7 relatives: mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter, or spouse. It is a bit strange, but being obligated to do something in Judaism matters more than doing it just because you want to. So if you're not required to mourn by Jewish tradition, for example, a friend is not required to mourn, it's like your mourning matters less. A friend's job is to provide comfort, not receive it. So in 1997, sitting in Jay's living room after his funeral, I feel it is my and my friend's responsibility to comfort Jay's younger brother, mom and dad, his family. I feel this way not because of anything Jay's family said to me, but because it is what I've been told is Jewish tradition. I am sad and bewildered, but in light of that tradition, those feelings strike me as selfish. I don't sit and cry, I help with the food instead. I do speak about Jay when other people share stories. And then later that afternoon, the meal concludes, the service ends. I hug Jay's family and spend some time with my friends outside the house. As, quote, just a friend and not a family member, Jewish tradition seems not to allow for my sadness and grief. So I say goodbye, drive back to the airport, and try to move on. As I look out the airplane window on the flight across the country, I need someone who understands what it is to lose a friend at a young age. I need someone who can tell me that I am not alone, but I am. And I share those first few paragraphs from the book because the book is what I call a rabbinic grief memoir. First and foremost, it is a memoir, it's a story. And I believe in the power of stories. I want you to know that as a rabbi, when someone passes away in my congregation, I give them, I don't give them my book immediately. I give them a book by Ron Wolfson, A Time to Comfort and a Time to Mourn. And it describes all of the different Jewish mourning practices with which we are so familiar. And it does so in a way that is accessible and friendly and important. And I give that book because when we're in the middle of it, we need a path set before us. When everything else in the world feels up in the air and completely out of control, it's good to have a path. And I believe in the wisdom of the Jewish tradition. But part of what I experienced in that moment is that all of the structures in the Jewish tradition sometimes get mistaken for the way that everything is supposed to unfold. One way of putting this is that we mistake the map for the journey. C.S. Lewis wrote a really important book called A Grief Observed, in which he said, this is one of the most important insights I've ever heard about grief. He said, grief requires a history, not a map. And let me say that again. Grief requires a history, not a map. And what he was saying is that there's no map for this journey that you go on. Quite famously, some of you may have heard of the stages of grief that were outlined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. One of the things that she writes about later is how her stages of grief were misunderstood. That many people say, oh, okay, you're supposed to go through these things. And she says, I never intended them to be understood as sort of a laundry list of things that everybody goes through or that people go through in a particular order. She said, these are some things that some people go through and they can help. But what's more important is a story, not because as you read my story, you your story has to be like my story, but the hope is that in reading a memoir, in reading somebody else's story, you can come to find your own story in the one which I share. And that feeling that I had at Jay's funeral and at the Shiva home outside of his house was one where I really felt like I was alone. I felt like because of the map that had been laid out by the Jewish tradition before me, that there wasn't necessarily a place for me. And if I fast forward from 1996 in December to 2007, I'm just curious how many of you knew Joel Schumann? You can raise your hands, right? So there are many of you did. So, when Joel passed away, I will say again what I said in the book about Jay and his family. There was everything that Heather and Coleman and Miles and Ellis, who are now grown, oh my gosh, I can't believe how old you guys are. But as little kids, you should know there was everything that you did was amazing and welcoming and didn't in any way, push me aside. But there was something in the Jewish tradition which didn't make room for me. And I came to Joel's funeral and I spoke at the funeral, and then I ended up, because the funeral was right before Thanksgiving, my wife Jennifer, who's on the call, we flew back to Los Angeles, and then Jen's mom was having a birthday celebration for Thanksgiving weekend, and we flew to Atlanta. And I remember this experience. Just one quick story: we were in Atlanta, and our kids were young, and we went to the Atlanta. It has an amazing aquarium, and we rented this van. And I'm pulling out of the parking garage, and I turned the wheel and crunch. Right, I just crunched in the entire side of this rental van that we had. And I remember doing that, and remember thinking to myself, "Of course you did that, Daniel, because there's no reason that you should be here. Why are you in a parking garage?" I was throwing myself back out into the world instead of taking the time to mourn, because something in me had said, in my interpretation of the Jewish tradition, said, as a mourner, as a friend, you're not officially a mourner, and so you don't do that thing called sitting Shiva, so you just go on with your life. And what I want to, Avi, I'm happy to make this more of a dialogue, but I think, when we talked about doing this, what has come for me is really a sense of how important it is that we in the Jewish tradition create communities that can acknowledge and make space for the many, many, many people who are affected by the death of someone who may not fall into those categories. Right? How do we create communities that are better able to comfort, of course, those who are in mourning, who are family members, but also those who sometimes are what psychologists call unacknowledged mourners, forgotten mourners. And I'll finish with just one other quick example, and then Avi, please jump in. There's some of you may be old enough to remember when I was growing up, there was a kid, he was on Time Magazine's front cover called The Boy in the Bubble. And The Boy in the Bubble, and he was severely immunocompromised, and he grew up, essentially lived in his entire life inside of this bubble in order to keep him safe. And his sister ended up writing a memoir about her experience of grief. It was called The Empty Room, and she talks about how people would come up to her, a year or 2, 3 years later, and you know what they would ask her? They would say, "How are your parents?" Right? And it's of course a nice question, but it's a question that also misses, hey, I had a brother who died, right? And there's an empty room. That was the name of her memoir. And sometimes, we, as well-meaning as we are, we're missing sort of all of those broken hearts, which are out there. And I called this a rabbinic grief memoir. I wrote a story of my own grief. It's not Heather's story. It's not Coleman and Miles and Ellis's story. It's not my wife's story, although all of those characters are in them. But it's just my story of what it was like for me to lose someone who was a best friend, someone who I loved very much, and to go through again that experience. The truth is I didn't really mourn for Jay the way that I should have, and when I was mourning Joel, I was also mourning Jay from before, and just trying to process the meaning of what it is to lose someone who I wanted to walk through the world with. So Avi, that's a little introduction. Let me stop and we'll make this a conversation. Everybody's amazing by continuing to be on Zoom for a little more time, but you go ahead now.
So I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit of something about me and how I see a little bit of something in what you're saying. So part of my job, part of my job portfolio with the shul is that I sort of oversee the process of funerals. And so even at funeral, at graveside, I am just making sure that everything is working properly. And sometimes when I first started, it was really nothing to me because I didn't really know most of these people. I didn't have any history with them. I remember one particular story, and this was I'd been working at the synagogue probably a good 10 years. I don't remember exactly when Saul Barzoon of blessed memory passed away, but he was an older man, but he was at Minyan several times a week, which I lead, and he also was volunteering a lot in the shul. And I remember at his funeral, in particular, something went wrong. Actually, we had somebody come onto the cemetery who shouldn't have been there, and we had to go chase him away. And I remember coming home that night and crying because I really wanted the opportunity to participate in the funeral, to be one of the mourners at the funeral, because he really meant a lot to me. And not only did I have to worry about the regular aspects of my job, I had to actually leave the tent of the funeral where it was happening and go and usher this person actually 2 or 3 times off of our grounds. And I just remember, it's for an entirely different reason why you felt unable to really participate in the mourning of Joel. But it's the idea that sometimes you really do need to mourn. The mourning process is just so important. So I wonder if you can share a little bit about, let's start with some of the positive aspects of the halachic framework of mourning that it gives you, and then talk about how it really did impact you, because I know that you touched on this, the idea that if you go to a Shiva minyan, I see Heather and the boys are with us now on Zoom too. Hi. How, because you are not the one obligated to sit Shiva, and I was touching on this in my sermon earlier, the idea that we have obligations in our Jewish rituals, and we have rituals that come from the heart, and you weren't obligated. You had a heart obligation. You weren't obligated from our Judaism, but from our heart. But the structure, really, the way it's set up, kind of prevented you, or at least made you feel prevented from fully participating in the mourning process.
Let me react in a couple of ways. First, I mean, it's an amazing story, and since we are doing Old Home Week at Shearith, I feel like I should share another Shearith rabbi who also went on to become the director of Camp Vermont in California. Was Rabbi Ed Feinstein. Am I right? Yes, I am. I'm remembering that right? And Rabbi Feinstein was my teacher. He was Joel's teacher, I think, at some point at rabbinical school too. He's an amazing rabbi, now the rabbi of VBS, and he taught our homiletics course. And I remember Rabbi Feinstein telling, talking about that experience that that many rabbis have, where he was at a funeral. I think this was the funeral of a child, God forbid, and where after the funeral he's pulled around the corner, or maybe it was after the shiva or something like that, and he just sort of burst into tears, right? And it was this burden that he was carrying between how do I sort of create a vessel, for others. It's not to say, by the way, that a rabbi should never cry, right? Of course, a rabbi should cry. But he was really felt in that moment that he was holding the community, and then he needed to make a space for his own grieving, and sort of what happens when you can't do that. And by the way, I want to say that this is, there, I've spoken with many physicians. I don't know how many physicians are on the call today, but physicians and anybody who's in the helping professions, where we are carrying the grief of others, and at the same time, of course, those things affect ourselves as well. And there's this tension between how do we do this, for others, and at the same time for ourselves. For me, I will also say, during that year, I was the director of camp. And first of all, I was very grateful not to be the director of a synagogue, not to be the rabbi of a synagogue, because I was having a really, really hard time, and I almost felt unqualified, right? I sort of said to myself, the answers that I would have given about God, if somebody had said to me, why did God do this? They would not have been so kosher, right? And I still have some pretty harif questions that I can ask, about God around Joel's death and his absence from the world. Boys, I know you know this, right? But your father, he was like the best, right? He was the best. He was an amazing teacher. He was an amazing person. And I like, when I say Shema, right? I remember your dad was getting a chemotherapy treatment, and he had his tallis and tefillin on, he had the guitar going, he's like leading people, and he's saying Shema, he's declaring God's oneness right there from his hospital room. And I'm sitting here going, God's oneness, what are you talking about, right? But he was my teacher, right? And I still, I don't try to answer the question of how it is that God could take Joel from the world. And I certainly wasn't able to answer that question in the year following his death. And so I was relieved, right, to be away from that responsibility, and you and Rabbi Sunshine and others don't have that luxury. And I feel a little bit more ready, able to do some of that now. But Avi, to your question about, I want to say I'm a rabbi, and please don't mistake me. This is not news. Rabbi is pro halacha, right? Rabbi is in favor of Judaism. I actually think not only in general, but Judaism has tremendous wisdom. Rabbi Sunshine, I'm sure you've encountered this as well in interfaith settings. When I meet my Christian clergy, colleagues and Muslim colleagues, they are often just blown away by the wisdom of the Jewish tradition. Some of it I mentioned by having that structure of saying, we have a name for this. It's called aninut. It's the period between when you have found out that somebody has died and the funeral, and you are relieved of all positive obligations, right? We don't say to you, say Shema, declare God's oneness when your dead is lying before you, right? And the wisdom of Shiva, of taking those 7 days, right? And saying not 2 or 3 or 5, and not something that you decide, but 7 days, and really having that structure there for you, and having the shloshim, and having the things that you refrain from. All of that, there's tremendous, tremendous wisdom in those things. I think what I would say, I'll tell you one story, Avi, that probably illustrates this best. It wasn't from the year after Joel passed away. It was from the year when Jay died. Jennifer, my wife Jennifer, and I was on the call. We were living in Chicago. And at that time, I had just gotten back from Israel, and I was going to Minyan on sort of regularly on weekday mornings before I went to work at the Leo Burnett advertising agency. There's a synagogue called the Loop Synagogue. And I went to the funeral in December, and I came back after, Christmas vacation, winter vacation. And there was this moment where I said to myself, okay, it's time for the Mourners Kaddish. Should I stand up and say Kaddish? Right? And I remember thinking to myself, right? And by the way, this is not something I recommend, right? I'm just sort of sharing my own, own foolishness in many ways. What I said to myself is no, because if I stand up and I say Kaddish, then somebody's going to come over to me who's saying Kaddish, and they're going to say, oh, who are you saying Kaddish for? And I'm going to have to say to them, I'm saying Kaddish for a friend. And if I told them that I was saying Kaddish for a friend, in my mind, what I thought is I'll be diminishing their grief. So I won't say Kaddish. Right? Now, I don't, again, I'm not endorsing that, right? Something had told me that somehow I wasn't allowed to say Kaddish. Now, I'm not the posek, I'm not the decisor of halakha for your community, but I will say that I have found nothing in the Jewish tradition which says that only the 7 family members are permitted to say Kaddish. I found nothing in the Jewish tradition which says that, right? Precisely the opposite. I can give you some examples from the Jewish tradition, where it's very clear that people who are beyond those 7 have obligations. In the Talmud, there are what are called aniim, avelim shniyim, which means secondary mourners. And it's very interesting. This is another story I'm going to share with you. A few years ago, my own father passed away. And I came home and was at a Shiva minyan. And our son Benjamin, as I stood up to say Kaddish for my father, my son Benjamin stood up and said Kaddish as well. And that was just his instinct, right? My dad sang Kaddish, and so I'm going to say Kaddish too. According to the Talmud, secondary mourners is precisely that. A secondary mourner, according to, this is in Moed Katan, is someone who, if you are obligated to mourn for that person if they were to pass away and they are saying Kaddish and they are mourning, then you join in their mourning when you're in their presence, right? And so there, the Talmud seems to give permission, and it may even require that grandchildren, in the presence of their parents, when their parents are saying Kaddish, join with their parents. I've been asked many times, right, are grandchildren permitted to say Kaddish? One other quick example is, and this is for any physicians, if you are in the room, or for anyone else, if you are in the room when someone dies, according to Jewish sources, whether or not you're one of the related relatives, you are obligated in Kriya. You're obligated to tear the ribbon or to tear your shirt. Right? And it's an acknowledgement, number one, of the incredibly powerful experience of being present in the room when someone's soul leaves the world. That is beyond the 7 relatives. And it's an example of how the categories that we have and we think are firm are less firm than they are. And so, I would just, I encourage all of us to, again, in terms of comforting those and also giving ourselves permission to figure out ways to acknowledge the many, many people who grieve for so many different types of death, and also for just so many different things that we encounter in our community.
So first of all, I want to say, well, thank you. If there's somebody who wants to ask a question, please let me know in the chat. I'm going to add to that because I think you were talking about this during your mourning for Jay, but also not just the actual halakha of things that are supposed to happen and not feeling right saying Kaddish, but the idea of that if you're in the Shiva house, you would be expected to help out, bringing food and comforting these 7 relatives who are mourners. But when you really feel like I want to be sitting with them and taking part of that, and so that may not be the formal aspects of doing kriya or saying kaddish, but just the way the whole structure is set up, that what's expected also of between the differences between the mourner and the mourners, the actual mourners, the 7 relatives, and other people who are trying to grieve as well.
Yeah, and I just want to name this, Heather, I don't know that you and I have ever talked about this, right? But like in that moment, I was, I was feeling 2 different things at once, as we often do, right? And Heather, was amazing, right? Because, on the one hand, there were times when I just went over and just gave you this hug, right? Like which was, it was a hug to comfort you, but it was also like I felt in that moment that you truly saw and understood the pain that I was experiencing, and that me expressing that wasn't sort of crowding you out or diminishing your grief. It was, it was a source of comfort to you too. And then, there were other pieces where, it was like, okay, we got to take care of Heather and these boys, right? Coleman, Miles, Ellis, like, love you guys now. You're a lot more self-sufficient now than you were then. Okay. Right. And, we took care of you and we jumped in, and part of what we were doing is we were saying, we're not going to let Heather carry this alone. Right. And I think that, both of those things are true. And each one of us, what I want to say is, there was a really good article, Avi, I can find it and send it to you and you can share it with the community. There was a good article years back, it was in the Los Angeles Times, and it talked about how when you're providing comfort, right, that the comforting should go go into the concentric circles, but not out, right? And it's a good model to sort of keep in mind, right? What was meant by that is when you are, when you're there to comfort somebody, your job is to not break down and put that person into the position of needing to take care of you, right? Because then you're just adding to the burden, right? And it's an important model. If you just sort of knew someone a little bit, your job is not to come in and to say to sort of fall apart all over them because of whatever you're going through. But it's also too rigid, right? Because the truth is that we do both, right? And I'll just share one example from the Talmud. The Talmud asks these great questions, okay? And one of them is, if you are in mourning and then someone in your community passes away, like, are you allowed to get up from your house of mourning and go over to the other house of mourning to be a comforter, right? And there's this it's an amazing question because it's about switching places and being in 2 places at once, right? If not physically, then emotionally. And I think that that's true. And if you're lucky, then you go through that with people, like Heather, who you can share that with. But it requires a lot of self-knowledge, and it requires a real sense of trust, with the people with whom you're mourning.
So I thank you. I have a couple of questions that people have chatted me. And before I have a question from Jim Rosenthal, and I have a question from Leslie Landsberg. I'm going to introduce Jim's question by reading something that you have in your book, but it's not your words. It's actually, you're quoting Rabbi Adam Raskin's eulogy words, just to set up the idea of at least part of, it's a small part of, but a part of what Joel meant to the community. And Rabbi Raskin writes, Every week in the Shabbat morning children's service that Joel led, he always featured the same story, the same dramatic moment. Each week, Joel would retell the story of Bilam, the pagan prophet, who was determined to curse the Jewish people with all his charisma. Joel would build up that moment when Bilam blessed instead of cursed the Jewish people. My daughter Nessa, then only a toddler, would be on the edge of her tuchus every week upon hearing that story, and she would scrunch up her face as if Joel was going to make some visible curse appear right before her eyes. But of course, the story would always end the same way. As Bilam blurted out, Ma tovu ha'olecha Yaakov, how beautiful are your dwelling places, O Jacob, Nessa and every other kid would breathe a sigh of relief. Thank God, another week, another curse averted, and the place would break out into song. It's just a little snippet of what Joel meant for us to help bring up our kids Jewishly. But he also had a great way with adults too. So it's not just the kids, but that's a snippet. So now I want to go to Jim's question, and Jim writes. And by the way, I showed you the picture earlier of at my wedding when I played with Joel at my wedding. Jim was the drummer that day. How does one mourn when feeling that someone has been taken unfairly? With Joel, a guy who did so much for others, teaching, playing music, even going to rabbinical school, how is this guy taken? How did the Schickman family maintain their faith?
So first of all, thank you for sharing that story. I don't know, I just want to say, I don't know if there's video somewhere of Joel telling the Bilam and Balak story. If there is, I would love a copy of that. So Heather, I'm just going to say, please share that, because that's like epic, right? And it's, there were kids at Camp Ramah in California and at Shearith and really in many, many, many different communities who all breathed an epic sigh of relief. And Avi, I want to just first acknowledge the depth of that question, right? And I cannot speak for Heather, and I cannot speak for the boys in terms of how you make it through something like that. I can, Heather took herself off mute, and maybe she will want to share. Do you want to go first, or should I say something?
Well, I'll give a personal, and then you can give the more rabbinic maybe, and personal. But Miles just wisely leaned over to me and said, some of us changed our definition of faith. Because yeah, there were many phases of, we each went through it differently. I had a lot of anger, carried that with me for a long time. And someone said, do you believe in God? And all I could say was, well, I'm really angry at somebody, so I guess I do. But Coleman really dives into the tradition and into the learning and the ritual. And others of us have moved further away into more philosophy and existential thinking. And some of us are still finding our way. And I really like what Miles said, that we change our definition of faith sometimes.
Yeah. So there's I want to say a word about that word faith. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge that Heather, you just gave the most important answer. Okay, all the rabbi stuff, the theology and things like that is, it's like dry, and all of this stuff is, to me, the truth of it is found in the experience. In the morning, we say a line. You can find it in the beginning of the Siddur, Modeh ani lefanecha. I think Joel used to, lead the singing of this. Modeh ani lefanecha. I'm not going to do it as well, so I won't try. Melech v'kayam she'achsarta bi nishmati b'chemla rabba emunatecha, which means I am grateful for you, everlasting and eternal King, that you returned my soul to me in as an act of grace or in graciousness. And then it's Rabba emunatecha, okay, which means how great is your faith, okay? And it's a strange thing to say to God, right? You're talking to God, right? And you say to God, how great is your faith, right? Because then that raises the question, wait a minute, God has faith, right? like God has faith in God, right? Like you wake up, God wakes up in the morning and says, I have faith in myself. Like, what does that mean? And I think the plain explanation of that line is Rabba emunatecha shouldn't be translated as how great is your faith, but rather should be translated as how great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. And what we're saying in that moment is, hey, God, every night, before I go to sleep, the rabbi said that sleep is 1/60th of death. Okay. And they have this sense that when you go to sleep at night, part of your soul leaves. And that when you wake up in the morning, you get your soul back, or you get part of your soul back. And what we're saying when we say Rabba emunatecha, we're saying to God, hey, God, I woke up again. I have a soul again this morning, right? You're pretty faithful, right? And the reason I mention that is because, Miles, you put it well, our definition of faith, for me, faith changed from being something a lot of people think of, do I have faith? As if like having faith is like a coin that you can hold in your hand and you put in your pocket. And you're like, yes, I am a person who has faith because here it is, it's in my pocket, as if faith is like something. And instead, what that line is saying is that faith is not an object, it's a process. It's showing up. It's being dependable over and over and over and over again. And so for me, part of the reason what I wrote about in that year after Joel died, another thing which I wrote about sort of what was it like to go through a year? What was it like to go through Hanukkah, right? And to a holiday about finding light in darkness when all I was experiencing was darkness. All I was experiencing was darkness, right? And yet I had to celebrate Hanukkah. Well, you know what? I lit the candles because could I do anything? I couldn't do anything more, right? So I lit the candles. And on Purim, something that we are sort of known for in the Greyber family, we had, and the Schickman family shared some pretty, shall we say, adventurous Purim celebrations. Okay, we go to Purim with a lot of verve and gusto. And what was it like to go through Purim that year, right? A year, but we had the Purim party. We didn't stop, right? We drank scotch and we listened and we grogged our groggers and we listened to the Megillah, a story about experience. What is the world like when God's name is absent from the world? And by the way, that was a Purim, right? Purim was my favorite holiday that year because I was, like you, Heather, I was angry and I was asking the question, where the HE double toothpicks is God, right? Where are you, right? And I was experiencing that. And Passover, the Schickman family and the Greyber family, we shared many Passovers together at Camp Vermont in California. And I remember the Passover before Joel came up, you guys came up, I think on 7th and 8th day, or you were up there for the beginning and then you had to go back because Joel had treatments. And then I found myself back at camp, right? And the year before I was saying Hallel, I was singing Hallel with Joel. And then the following year, his voice is absent. He's not there. And for me, faith was, I don't know what all of these things mean in the face of Joel's death, but I'm gonna keep with it, right? And I'm going to try to find what wisdom I can from this. And that to me was the dependability that sort of continuing to show up. Heather, it looks like Coleman wants to say something. Am I reading that right? No. Okay. There was just a little gesturing. Let me say one other thing real quick, and then Avi, I think that a lot of times, and this I think is very important, a lot of times when people need to cry out, Heather, you said you were angry at God. Yes, right? And in the book, by the way, you will read, there's some things that, you may think rabbis shouldn't say them, right? In the story of the Exodus, which we're going to read, in a week, when Moses shows up, does exactly what God says, and what happens? Pharaoh says no, and says, not only that, but I'm going to make you produce more bricks, and we're not giving you the straw. And you know what Moses says to God? Lama hareota la'am hazeh. Why, God, have you done evil to this people? That's the words from Moshe Rabbeinu. And what I want to say is, if that's good enough for Moshe Rabbeinu, it should be good enough for us, right? There is nothing un-Jewish about being angry at God. There is nothing un-Jewish about crying out. And too many times when people need to cry out, they are told by people who may mean well, but they're told, shh, don't say that. As if God needs defending. And what's happening there is that people are afraid of the anger and they're afraid of the emotions. And they act as if God needs defending. God doesn't need defending, right? It's we who are afraid. And my deepest wisdom for all of my work in grieving is to learn to be present with wherever a person is in their grief. To just be present and to sit with it and to hold it. It is true that when we can do that, the comfort of just saying to a person, you're not alone. What you feel is not out of bounds. What you feel is okay. That is a great gift. And there are no words that you need to use, right? And what we end up doing is we end up using cliches, right? And we can all go over our favorite ones, right? Of terrible things that people say at Shiva homes or at a funeral or something like that. And we don't, most of the time, the deepest, best thing that we can do is be present and to acknowledge where people are.
Thank you so much. It's so real, the idea that you have the right to be angry when you're feeling angry at God. And Heather said it so well earlier when asked how did she have faith. She said, I knew I was angry at somebody, at something, right? And that, so absolutely. I have one more question and then we'll wrap up. But before that question, and the question from Leslie, I'm just going to read a comment that Carrie Greyber wrote in the chat. She said, we remember every Shabbat Joel telling the story at Shearith for the kids. My daughter Abigail Yael, who was born shortly after Joel passed away, will be doing the parsha of Joel's favorite story this summer in Israel for her bat mitzvah. And I know I can't wait for that either. So, but I'm going to relay a question from Leslie, who asks, my brother, who left his Jewish life behind many years ago, is dying soon. I am trying to figure out if I want to say Kaddish for him. Should I ask him? Is this something he would want, or is it only for me?
It's an amazing question. I believe very much, and I think in the rabbinic sources you will find this, that the operative word, the operative rabbinic term around death, almost all of the traditions around death is kavod hamet, okay, which means honoring the person who has died. And there is a lot of truth to that. However, what I want to say is honoring the person who has died first of all, sometimes that expresses itself in things that we do to care for the body, such as the tahara, the washing of the body, and trying to have the burial as quickly as possible, because in the Jewish tradition, the understanding is that when the body is left unburied, then that it should take place as soon as possible. But also, sometimes we honor the person who has died by, the example that I just mentioned. We can also honor the person who has died by waiting a little bit too, right? In other words, if somebody has somebody has died, and there are special and important people who, if we wait 24 hours, can be at the funeral, right? Rather than just sort of rushing to do the funeral as quickly and as soon as possible, there's also an honor to the person by having people be there to be able to say Kaddish and to be able to be present at the funeral. So honor sort of works, in some ways we have to pay attention to ourselves, right? And ask ourselves, how can we best honor this person? So first of all, I would say that the act of saying Kaddish, I think, for someone, is a way of honoring them, even if we, and here the obligation would be there. But the other piece is, some of these things are for us too, okay? We don't, we don't have to, I don't think that we have to ignore our own grief in order to do everything the way that the person who died would want, okay? Sometimes we need to say Kaddish, and you are not going to be, none of us have been around long enough to know whether it's offending a person who's died or not, right? Nobody's come back to tell us, right? But I don't think that we should sort of prevent ourselves from grieving and from doing what we can with the purpose of honoring them, right? But also honoring our own emotions and feelings through saying Kaddish. And this, I think, is part of the wisdom of halakha, right? That Jewish law can guide us by saying, you know what, this isn't about me, and it's not all about my feelings. I do have an obligation, right? I do have an obligation as a sibling to say Kaddish, and even if that person wasn't a believer, you're not impending upon them. You're not forcing your beliefs down their throat. They have passed away, okay? But you can still say Kaddish. Heather, to your question, I saw in the chat about how it is that you honor people who have died who are not Jewish. I think that here, first of all, I'm going to say something that may be controversial, but we don't live in communities so much where each one of us has to figure out how do we interact with the Jewish tradition. I don't think anybody can find a source that says, whether or not it's permitted or forbidden to say Kaddish for somebody who's not Jewish, right? I don't know that, the rabbis couldn't have imagined such a question, right? Because it was a very, very different world. With that said, right, that was the controversial part. I do think that the saying of Kaddish is generally something that's reserved for people who are Jewish. And I think that there's integrity to those traditions, but I also think that there are a lot of ways that we can mourn and honor someone without saying Kaddish. Right? The Jewish tradition itself tells us that the giving of tzedakah, right? That the doing of tzedakah, the giving of tzedakah is a way of perpetuating a person's memory by doing more acts of justice and goodness in the world. And I think that, oftentimes there's so much community which is built in those projects of, maybe we're going to run a race. Heather, I have on my wall behind me, you can't see them, but they're pictures of a triathlon that I did in Joel's memory. Let me tell you that wasn't an easy triathlon. but those things, we raised money for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. That's an act of tzedakah that we can do. You don't have to be Jewish. The person doesn't have to be Jewish to do that. You're bringing more justice and light into the world. I think that there are other ways in which we can honor people whose memory has died. Certainly, I also think some of these prayers like Yizkor, again, primarily reserved for people who have passed away who are Jewish. But I will tell you, I have some non-Jewish swimming friends from growing up, Avi, you mentioned, whose names I'll include along with all of my teachers and Joel's name and others who have passed away as well. And I think, personally, we have to find our way through that.
Thank you so much. I just want to recommend to people, actually, Rabbi Graber's book. And what I love, is Faith Unravels. What I love is, my favorite part is the sermon that you give at camp on Yizkor Pesach. What is it? Is it a half a year later or a year and a half later? After
half a year later, yeah.
And I really loved what you said there, and just hard to say. I loved reading about your processing of the whole experience. It's a hard thing to process, but I also want to thank you for giving us this opportunity as a community. I know we were there as a community to mourn Joel at his funeral, but life went on after that, right? And as it always does. But it's good to be able to process it some more. And I'll read a comment that Rabbi Sunshine wrote. So we also have a tshuva from the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards that enables those who have converted to Judaism to mourn ritually for their non-Jewish immediate relatives by saying the Kaddish. Just a good note to add on.
And I added there just to complement what Rabbi Sunshine said. Rabbi Joel Rembaum wrote that tshuva, and what's important about it is it not only enables but requires, right? In other words, and I think this is very strong. People who have converted are required in the same way as anybody else who is Jewish to mourn their parents, whether or not their parents, even though their parents are not Jewish. Heather asked me, Avi, can I take another second, since Heather asked me this in the chat, to share how I met her? So just briefly, right, I realized I didn't really share that, but I was the director of Camp Ramah in California. And there was this Rosh Musica, Heather, I think you know David Ross. He was the long time Rosh Musica for camp. And we were facing a real crisis because David needed to step away. And it was like one of these positions of, how am I going to ever fill it? And who's going to step into his shoes? And somehow I heard that there was this new rabbinical student who was moving. He was starting in the fall, and he lived in Dallas, and he was a musician. And I said, and I called, and I was, now you guys ended up coming the summer before started rabbinical school, is that right? Yeah. And I said, please, let's do this. And I have to say, I'll just say two quick things about this. One, Joel was so amazing because at camp, to step into the shoes of somebody who's been there forever is really, really hard. Like, it's really hard because all the time people are sort of saying, well, why don't you do it this way instead of that way? David Ross, for example, always used to play piano in the Chadar, and Joel played guitar, right? And this was like, what? We're doing Shirah with the guitar? And he had this amazing way of being really respectful of the camp traditions and learning the camp songs and everything that worked, but also adding his own his own take on it, which was amazing. And the other thing, which I just want to say, and my wife Jennifer is on the call too. So boys, the thing you should know is that Jennifer and I have 3 boys. and they're basically, the exact carbon copy of those three boys that are sitting next to each other. We have an oldest child who's 21, and Coleman is 21. We have a middle child who is 19, and Miles is 19. And we have a youngest child who's 15, and Ellis is 15, right? All the same ages. And so the truth is that and this is part of the reason why losing Joel was so difficult for me, is that, I all of us who have been parents know that we go through that experience of, where is the instruction manual? Okay, none of us know how to do this. And the most helpful thing in being a parent is having somebody who you can parent with, and with whom you can share your questions and your frustrations, and who you can watch, right? And be like, oh, that's a much better way of doing that than I ever did it. And Joel was that for me. We started out as, I was the head of the camp, and he was the Rosh Musica, but very quickly he ended up coming and having coffee on my porch, and we ended up spending Sundays together in Los Angeles, when the traffic died down and they could actually come over from the valley, or we could go over to the valley. We had standing play dates every week. And what we were doing is we were raising our kids together, and we were building a life together. And Joel, in that sense, was my brother. He was playing the role of what brothers used to do when brothers lived in the same cities as others, as other siblings. And Joel was my brother. He was teaching me how to try to be a good father. And he was a friend, and those years, I carry with me the sting of his death. I carry with me the wisdom of hopefully being a more compassionate and sensitive rabbi and person, for all those who mourn. And I carry with me, it's taken me a while, I will say. I guess I was thinking about this is a bar mitzvah, right? This is 13 and a half years. And it has taken me a long time to be able to also taste the sweetness, and to carry with me the sweetness of the chance that I had to be with him and to learn with him. And to this afternoon, for everybody here, it's just joyful. And Avi, I want to thank you for creating this and making it possible. It's very, very special for me to return to Shearith, and to be with the Schickman family, and to share the book, which I hope. I tell people, this is not helping to send the kids to college. There's not a lot of, my deepest hope is that the book can be a source of comfort, can perpetuate Joel's memory, and also be a source of comfort for all those